here. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's proceedings. I'm Utrice Lead, the executive producer and host of Talkback, and a cheap plug here. Which airs from 3 to 5 p.m., I have to plug my program, Monday through Thursday, on your favorite radio station, which is what? I thought so. WBAI 99.5 on your FM dial. Just a few notes before we get to the business at hand here tonight. First, I should warn you that my job is to maintain order, and there will be order. I learned from your dear mayor. A little humor. And order we shall have. Yes, your enthusiasm is strongly encouraged. But please, don't attempt to throw chairs. We want every last word from our participants to be heard, so I ask that you be quiet to allow them the opportunity to present their views. And so we'll move on. If you must move around, try to be as quiet as possible. I know it's warm. It certainly is warm here. It's going to get hotter too, yes. But they're trying to open up the window or two so we can have some air. Just this afternoon, I got a call in the office, and someone wanted to know what the discussion was to be here tonight. And I told him, generally what it was about. He says, "Oh my God, you mean they're still discussing this stuff?" I said, "Yeah, of course they're still discussing this stuff, because this stuff is the stuff that scholarship is made of, and that academic inquiry is made of. Tonight we enter the world of scholars who have diametrically opposing views on the subject of the origins and foundations of what we know today as Western civilization. One school of thought is that it is distinctly African or Afro-Asian in origin. The other, that Western civilization in large measure is the bequest of ancient Greece. Make no mistake, this is not a mere difference of opinion in the ivory tower. The battle itself has become an allegory for something as important as the debate itself. Academic insurgents have breached the ramparts of the Academy's high priesthood, and the battle is as much for the authority to write history and for how to write history. Our task tonight is to ferret out the truth insofar as we can discern it, but more importantly, to question and challenge. And we have 4 incredible people with us tonight, and I'd like to introduce them to you and have them come to the stage as they're introduced. Already on stage is Professor John Henrick Clarke. They were standing for you, Dr. Clarke. Teacher, historian, writer, lecturer, John Henrick Clarke is a unique resource and a special institution in the African world. Beginning in his early years, Dr. Clarke studied the world history of African people and became a master teacher. He has authored and/or edited more than 30 books, short stories, and pamphlets on African and African American history, and is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of African World History in the Department of Africana and Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. Professor John Henrick Clarke. I'd like to ask to the stage Dr. Martin Bernal. Dr. Martin Burnell has been a professor of government at Cornell University since 1972 and an adjunct professor of Near Eastern Studies also at Cornell since 1986. Educated at King's College, Cambridge, where he earned his doctorate in Chinese Studies in 1966, and at Peking University, the University of California, and Harvard, Dr. Burnell's works have been widely reviewed and criticized, in many instances as controversial. His chief publications are the two-set volume, Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, and Cadmean Letters, The Westward Diffusion of the Semitic Alphabet Before 1400 BC. Dr. Martin Burnell. I invite to the stage Professor Mary Lefkowitz. Thank you. Nice to meet you. Thank you. You can sit right here. Mary Lefkowitz is Andrew Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Wellesley College. She is the author of Not Out of Africa, How Afrocentrism Became an Excuse to Teach Myth as History, and is co-editor of Women's Life in Greece and Rome. With fellow Wesleyan Guy McLean Rogers, she co-edited Black Athena Revisited, a collection of 20 essays by scholars from a broad range of disciplines who take dead aim at Dr. Burnell's Black Athena specifically, but contend generally that the Africa-centeredness of scholarship on the roots of what is called classical civilization is blatant revisionism. Dr. Mary Lefkowitz. I invite to the stage Professor Guy McLean Rogers. Professor Rogers, as I said, is also at Wellesley College, where he is an associate professor of Greek and history. With Dr. Lefkowitz, he co-edited Black Athena Revisited and is author of The Sacred Identity of Ephesus, Foundation Myths of a Roman City. Professor Rogers. So here we have a rather distinguished panel, and I would like them first to begin with their conclusions. They will have about no more than 5 minutes to summarize their major thrust this evening. Professor Clarke, we will start with you.
The one single point I wish to get across before we start anything, I am not here to debate with anyone. I have devoted all of my adult life to this subject. I only debate with my equals. All others I teach.
There will be order. Thank you.
Shall we continue or what? I'm not clear.
Go ahead, Dr. Clarke.
You trees.
Go ahead, Dr. Clarke.
Broadly speaking, honestly speaking, the book, Not Out of Africa, a good sophomore effort, is not really about Not Out of Africa. Last year, it was the bell curve. This year is not out of Africa. Next year, it'll be something else. This is part of a world war against the role of African people in the history of the world. If we began history, began mankind, how is it that the last branch of the human race to enter that arena, marked civilization, now think they brought civilization? Now, it is part of a war over and above Professor LEFKOWITZ's book and over and above her political naivete. Her naivete is about what is happening in the Western world. There was a recent book called The Tribes. It diagrammed every people, major people on the earth, searching for a piece of turf for themselves. It left out the African people because the other people, including Asian imperialists, have plans to take over Africa. There have been several articles in the New York Times advocating the recolonization of Africa. This book and other literature of this nature mean to prepare the world to accept a rationalization for the re-enslavement of Africa. Now, and when you deal with professional white behind kissers, and as Carlos Cook, a disgrace to the skin they wear. These people, if I'm be so kind to call them that, are running from themselves and teaching us a lesson that we should have learned long ago. Sometimes white wannabes are more dangerous than whites. And sometimes they'll fight you harder to be accepted by whites. They are running from their own people.
2 minutes.
And running from definition. Now, what we need to look at now is how Professor LEFKOWITZ neglected the white writers through history, the radical European writers who wrote positively of Africa and who identified the relationship of Africa to the ancient Greeks. Now, if given time, and I probably won't be given it this evening, I can prove to you with your satisfaction, if you are listening, that Rome and Greece was not European creations. These were Mediterranean-inspired nations and couldn't be created by Europe because at the time there was no Europe.
You'll have to leave it there, Dr. Clarke. You'll have to leave it there for the moment.
All right.
Thank you very much. I now ask Professor LEFKOWITZ to present her 5-minute conclusion.
Can you hear me? Maybe you don't want to hear me. But let me just begin by saying what my book, Not Out of Africa, isn't about. It's not an attack on Afrocentrism. If Afrocentrism means recognition of African achievements in the world, it doesn't seek to deprive Africans of their rightful heritage. Africans do not need Greece to have a cultural heritage. They have a rich cultural heritage. Egypt is just one part of it. They don't need Greece. I'm concerned because what is being offered in some quarters as African history is really a European myth. And thus, instead of getting real information about Africa, what people are learning is something that's really 18th century French. It's Eurocentric, it's based on Greek and Roman myths. I do not myself think that one should do that, because Egypt itself is so fascinating, so rich. There is so much that you can learn and know, and that I myself, as a result of all this work that we have been doing for the last 4 years and more, have come to know and understand about Egypt. I would like to now spend a great deal of the rest of the time that I have learning about that, because it is so different. It's so different from what the Greeks thought that it was. Herodotus was very impressed by Egypt. He wanted to say that everything in Greece that he could think of came or had some connection with Egypt. He didn't really understand the depth and richness of Egypt, which went in directions way beyond what he knew from his own experience in Greece. So I am concerned about that in Not Out of Africa. I've tried to explain why the notion of an Egyptian mystery system, which is basically a French invention, it's based on a novel that everyone has forgotten about, but still you can find it in some very obscure libraries, get it up in Boston even, and that book, which was by a French priest, is based on Greek and Roman sources and tries to describe a Greco-Roman Egypt, and that this myth was preserved in Freemasonry and thus came into American culture. So I'm concerned that that myth not be taught, the notion that there was an Egyptian mystery system. Instead, I'd like to see people learn, all people learn, not just black people, white people, any people learn about Africa and the civilizations therein. And Egypt is particularly appealing because it's so old, it's so impressive, its role in the Mediterranean was so vast, and so many other civilizations were touched by it. Even if only slightly, they did get touched by it, and we have to work on that. I would like to say, just in my last 2 minutes, that from my point of view and the point of view of my colleague Guy Rogers, the ancient world is multicultural, and that one cannot study any one bit of it without studying every other bit of it. And the debate tonight, and I hope the debate will go on for many, many years because so many of us will learn from it, that debate should investigate the degree and extent of those links. Myself, as I think you know, I don't think that Greek philosophy was stolen from Egypt. I do not believe there is any evidence to show that. I think that because Egyptian philosophy, and there is such a thing as Egyptian philosophy and deep Egyptian religious thought, which is very, very complicated, and I myself need to know more about it still. But it's not like the Greeks. It may in many ways be richer and better than some of the concept.
Well, you'll have to leave it right there for the moment. I would like Professor Bernal to conclude in 5 minutes or less.
Well, can people hear me? Yeah. I agree with Professor Lefkowitz that Africa does not need Greece. There are plenty of glorious African civilizations. It's just that it happens to have Greece, or to have influenced Greece to a significant thing. This is not an issue of politics, it's an issue of history, the way things were. Now, Greece is extremely important because it is the single greatest source of European culture, and therefore we are concerned with it. And it is very interesting to note that European culture did not begin in Germany or Sweden, but at the extreme southeast corner of Europe, and the reason for that is quite straightforward. It was the closest area to the great civilizations of northeastern Africa and southwest Asia, and this East Mediterranean complex was the source of Greek and hence, I believe, European culture. Now, that's not to deny that there was a great deal of local development within Greece, and I certainly do not propose that Greek culture was merely a projection or an imitation of Egyptian or Semitic culture. It's clearly a very distinctive culture, but to try and understand Greek culture without knowing the background of the ancient cultures behind it would be as absurd as it would be to study Japanese culture without knowing the Chinese and Korean roots behind it, and no East Asian specialist would dream of doing that. That you have to see the cultures as interrelated, and that the older cultures and the more elaborate cultures had the predominant cultural influence. One of our basic disagreements is that Mary Lefkowitz, sitting in the 20th century, feels that she knows better than the Greek historians of the 5th and 4th, 3rd century, when they said that there were significant influences. Yes, he was very impressed. Yes, he was very Greek. But what struck him were specific similarities. And Herodotus, a rather plodding historian, he said, well, what's the reason for these similarities? I think they're too close for coincidence. I don't think the Egyptians could have borrowed them from the Greeks because they've had them so long. Therefore, the most likely explanation is that the Greeks took them from the Egyptians. And this is what I call the ancient model. And this model was not overthrown until the early 19th century. Now, Mary Lefkowitz mentions the 18th century novels, and at times, despite the attention she's devoted to dismissing my book, I sometimes feel she hasn't read it, because I do devote quite a few pages to the novel Zetos, which she talks, and I too have read it. It had to be sent by interlibrary loan to me, and I do think it is important in the formation of Masonic thought. But what she does not bring forward is the fact that this was perfectly orthodox history as understood in the 18th century, and going back beyond the 18th century to the view that the Greeks and Romans had of the Egyptian sources of their own culture. Now, I think that the Greeks were, on the whole, a very intelligent people, and I respect their philosophy, their art, their democracy, their science, but I also respect their history, and this is a great anomaly in Mary Lefkowitz's approach, in that she says they're very good in these other respects, but they cannot be trusted with their own history. So that I want to bring that out, that one has... Now, she says that modern classics has dismissed all this, and it's true that the predominant view of modern classicists is that the debts to Egypt and Phoenicia, and I don't want to underestimate the importance of Levantine or Southwest Asian influences on Greece, that these influences were exaggerated by the Greeks, and I think that they clearly were I think they were properly developed, and to some extent the Greeks may even have played down because they were very conscious of being Greek and proud as being Greeks, and they were affected by two forces. On the one hand, they wanted to plug in to the ancient civilizations and give themselves cultural depth. On the other hand, they were very conscious of being Greeks and wanted not to be surpassed culturally by the Egyptians and Phoenicians, who were still very much around. So they had two forces working on them. Modern scholars working in an intensely racist 19th and 20th century had no double force. They had the single force wanting to make Greece pure, white, and European, and the ideological pressure that put on the scholars led to what I see as the recent dismissal of Egyptian and Phoenician influences on ancient Greece.
Thank you. Professor Rogers, please do present your conclusion in 5 minutes or less.
Thank you. I'd just like to say from the beginning that Professor Lefkowitz and I are here precisely because we're open to debate about these issues. 3.5 years ago, the University of North Carolina Press asked Professor Lefkowitz and me to put together a volume of responses to some of the questions which are either implicitly or explicitly raised by Professor Bernal in his work, Black Athena. And what I would like to do for just a couple of minutes here, and perhaps expand upon this a little bit later, is to set out some of those questions and to give you some sort of sense of what the preliminary Thanks. Preliminary answers to the questions that the contributors to our volume found. Obviously, among the important questions that people have been concerned with, number one, were the ancient Egyptians black? 2, did the ancient Egyptians or the Hyksos colonize Greece? 3, did the ancient Egyptians or the Phoenicians massively influence the early Greeks in the areas of language, religion, science, or philosophy? 4, did 18th and 19th century scholars obscure the Afro-Asiatic roots of classical civilization for reasons of racism and anti-Semitism? Let me give you some sense of our conclusions. Number one, the scholars who have looked carefully at the first question have concluded that the attempt to fit the ancient Egyptians into a modernizing category of either black or white do so from a perspective which lacks both historical and biological justification. Did the ancient Egyptians or the Hyksos colonize what would later become Greek lands in the 2nd millennium? Unambiguous archaeological evidence to that effect is lacking in the Mediterranean. Did the ancient Egyptians and the Phoenicians massively influence the Greeks in the areas that I outlined? There is no doubt, and no one has denied for at least 50 years that I know of, that there was Egyptian influence on early Greek culture in several different areas. In areas, actually, that curiously Professor Bernal skips over, like art and architecture. The real scholarly question is, can that influence be described as massive in the sense that Professor Bernal means? And the conclusion, which scholars from many different subdisciplines, and not just classicists, but Egyptologists, Semiticists, and African historians have reached, is that the case cannot be made for a massive influence. Furthermore, students of the ancient world propose a very different model of interaction among the cultures of the ancient world in the time period that we're discussing. Instead of seeing a one-way street leading from Egypt to Greece, scholars now are shaping a model which includes many two-lane highways going from Egypt to Greece, going from Egypt to the Near East, to West Asia, and back in the other direction as well. What about racism and anti-Semitism in 18th and 19th century historiography? Yes, there were some scholars who operated from a framework which we would consider to be both racist and anti-Semitic. But an undifferentiated picture of racism and anti-Semitism cannot be sustained on the basis of the evidence.
Thank you. Well, you've heard their conclusions, and we'll get to the amplification of their conclusions as we go on in the evening. But I wanted first to ask each of the discussants tonight how they came to this particular area of study, and how scholastically have they undertaken comparative analysis in this particular area of study. How, in effect, are you preparing, or have you prepared yourself? We'll start at this end of the table and go straight down. Yes.
I'm not sure I quite understand what you're asking. Are you asking how we became interested, or what our scholarly preparation was?
Both. And
Both.
I'm asking
Okay.
particularly, in as much as you exert influence by virtue of your scholarship in this area, I'm asking, how do you defend your scholarship in this area? How did you acquire your scholarship in this area?
Okay. In a way, I am, I think, an example of the kind of training that Professor Bernal has been calling for, because I have the advantage of not having an undergraduate degree in classics, but an undergraduate degree in ancient history, which included, where I was taught, not only Greece and Rome, but also Egypt and Persia and Phoenicia and Palestine. So that's my preparation. How do I defend my scholarship? I don't have to defend all of the different areas which are raised by Black Athena or issues that we're talking about. The whole point of putting together a collected volume with scholarly views by different people is to offer different perspectives on these questions. My own particular expertise happens to be in the eastern part of the Mediterranean from about 1200 BCE to 300 CE.
So are you saying that you were a facilitator of a frontal assault?
A frontal assault on what?
As opposed to, in this book, Black Athena Revisited. If you're saying that you're not yourself prepared to defend the scholarship in this book.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm certainly prepared to defend the scholarship in this book, but I don't claim, and I don't think that anyone else would claim to be an expert in the 27 different fields which Professor Bernal raises. In that sense, we're all students of the...
If you'd pardon me, Professor Bernal will defend his own work. I'm saying that you, as a co-editor of this book, I would have assumed, perhaps it's naivety on my part, that part of your role is also to inspect the scholarship of contributors to your book, as well as to exercise some kind of scholastic judgment as to their expertise on the subject.
I think your question is now a little bit clearer, and my answer to it is that I stand completely behind our conclusions, and I take full responsibility for them. Is that clear enough?
Well, I was under the impression I was saying what I had to say quite well. You evidently are having difficulty trying to understand, and that's an entirely different problem, one which I'm happy to say belongs almost singularly to you. Professor Lefkowitz, how did you come by your scholarship in this area, and how do you defend your scholarship in this area?
Well, I come by my scholarship in this area as a classical scholar. I have an undergraduate degree in classics and a PhD in classics. My work has been widely through the whole field of Greece and Rome. I became particularly interested in a neglected field. It was neglected entirely when I came to it, which was the study of women in the ancient world. Half of the women in Greece and Rome, and I think elsewhere in the ancient world as well, were simply, half the people were ignored. So I became very interested in that and spent a lot of time on that, which involves many different periods of antiquity. I got interested in this subject because I was asked to write a review for the New Republic magazine of Martin Bernal's 2 volumes, and at the same time I was asked to consider such influential and important books as George G.M. James's Stolen Legacy. So that's how I got into this. My perspective is simply that of a person who seeks to understand history and who uses evidence. I defend myself by citing my sources and the materials. Anyone can check these references. My goal is not to stifle discussion or to do anything I do not seek to indoctrinate. I have no agenda, even though many may be imputed to me. I have none. You may say that, but how do you know what is in my mind? If I am a white person or a Jewish person, does that mean that someone has told me what to say or told me what to think?
Professor Lefkowitz, have you been to Africa?
No, I have not been to Africa. Have you?
Have you studied in Africa?
No, I have not studied in Africa. I never said I did.
Can you tell me the African scholars to whom you have referred in your scholarship?
I have referred to the writings that are in Black Athena Revisited by some distinguished Egyptologists, such as John Baines and David O'Connor and Frank Yurko. I can only refer to those in detail. I have read many other things, but I do not pretend at any time to be a scholar of Africa and Egypt. I must rely on others for that, including Martin Burnell, whose work I, in spite of his suggestion, I read, and I know I could find the pages very easily on Terrasson that he mentions. And it is an example of the comprehensiveness of his work that he knows this obscure source.
In writing as prolifically as you have on ancient Greece, have you been to Greece?
Yes, many times.
I thought so. I would like to ask the same question of Professor Burnell.
Well, my training was not in this area at all. It was in East Asia, Chinese, Japanese, and to some extent Vietnamese. And the one advantage of learning Chinese, in particular the Chinese writing system, is that it makes you somewhat less frightened of others. I had done a very little Greek at school, and I tried to teach myself more as I did Hebrew. But essentially, over the last 20 years, I have been an autodidact, that is, teaching myself, but in a very privileged situation, in that I was a teacher at a university, so I could go to the experts, ask them naive questions about the new subject that I was looking at, and they were extraordinarily generous in responding to me. So that I did get information in this way. I was also given a very broad historical background by my father, who read me H.G. Wells's Outline of History over 6 years with various glosses, so that he gave me a sense that one could understand history, one could see things in larger contexts and sometimes even in global contexts, and that I found very useful and confidence building. But I always insisted, and I say this in the introduction to Volume 1, that I am trying to open doors for people who have more or are better equipped in a specialized sense to go through, because there are many areas that I look at and touch on but cannot follow through. So I wouldn't claim a deep expertise. Yes, I have been to Greece. Yes, I have been not only to Egypt, but to Tunisia, to Malawi, to Zambia, to Zimbabwe. So I have some experience of Africa. So I have that background, and I think that has helped me in my general approach.
In your books, your 2 volumes, Professor Burnell, the Black Athena volumes, are you suggesting that you initiated much of this information, or are you picking up from where others have left off?
Well, I mean, I start off looking at the ancient sources, the ancient Greek sources, their view of their own history, but I don't take them on face value. I then try to check, looking at archaeological, linguistic, cultic information from other sources. So I was using a multidisciplinary approach, and I am eclectic, and I've been accused of that. But I think in these areas where there's so little information that one cannot follow the rigor of pursuing one particular discipline, like linguistics or something like that, one has to look across the board.
I was referring specifically to the scholarship of African scholars.
Yes, I mean, although I must confess that I came to them rather late on in my study, and to some extent I found that I had reinvented the wheel. That there was a great deal of what I had laboriously tried to assemble for myself had been assembled, and this was very striking in the case of scholars like Du Bois or Sinclair Drake, but also many of Sheikh Anta Diop and others provided extraordinarily useful avenues for me to pursue. I wouldn't call myself an Afrocentrist, except to the extent that I believe that Africans and peoples of African descent have played many significant roles in world history. and that these have been systematically denied by European and North American scholars in the 19th and 20th century. I think that the degree of racism in our society can hardly be overestimated. We all have it, and it's very, very difficult to see past it.
All right, thank you very much. Professor Clarke.
I came to this subject before I was 10 as a Baptist Sunday school teacher. I wanted to teach junior class in Sunday school, so I learned to read very early. What baffled me from the beginning was the Bible itself. I could not find my people in a book that's supposed to be about all mankind. And what called my attention to the neglect of Africa was the Sunday school lessons with all those white angels. And when they said God is love, God is kind, God is no respecter of kith or kin, I kept wondering, why didn't he let at least one or two little brown or black angels sneak into heaven? So I began to suggest that somebody else had tampered with God's book in favor of somebody else, and that the Bible, to a great extent, was a rationale for European domination, but had been used as such. Then, coming to, after leaving Georgia, after a white man that I've worked for, if he's alive today, he's a liberal with a capital L. His name was Gagsteiner. I asked him about some books on the African people in ancient history. And in the language of the South, he let me down slow. I mean, he spoke kindly. He said, John, I'm sorry that you came from a race that's made no history. But if you persevere, if you obey laws and study hard, you make history someday, and you personally might one day be a great Negro like Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was the one thing whites approved of at that time. All right, while doing chores at a local high school, holding the coat and the books of a recitalist, I opened a book called The New Negro, and I found an essay by a Puerto Rican of African descent, Arthur Schomburg. The essay was called The Negro Digs Up His Past. Now I knew I was not only older than slavery, I was older than my oppressor, and my oppressor was the last branch of the human race to enter that arena. Mock civilization. Don't get mad, get smart, prove me wrong. Now, in the old Harlem History Club, under Willis and Huggins, long since dead, John Jackson, who died only a few years ago, we had to take up a collection to bury him, Charles Seifert, J. Rogers, under all of these teachers pointing me to good material, and Arthur Schomburg telling me, go study the history of your masters. Study the people who took you out of history. Then you'll understand your history. I started on an old chestnut, recently mentioned, H.G. Wells' Outline of History. It is still worth reading. It is a good basic outline. His basic facts are in order. When he tells you about the Crusades, he's not off one iota. But his interpretation is basically Eurocentric to the point of being a prejudiced document. Now, I was reading these kinds of books. I was reading Spingarn's Decline of the West when I was 18 years old. So I began to read European masterpieces, and I began to read European curiosity about Africa. Gerald Massey's 6th volume, Egypt, Light of the World, 2 volumes. Natural Genesis, 2 volumes. Book of the Beginning, 2 volumes. And I began to read Gerald Massey's attitude on religion and his idea that nearly European concepts of religion were stolen from outside of Europe. He was not a historian. He was not an Egyptologist. He was an agnostic, fighting the arrogance of the European of that day. See, the History Club led me to not only reading masterpieces by white radical writers who set the black radical writers in motion. A whole lot of claims blacks did not make until they saw the documents and works written by Europeans. And these works written by Europeans, what black had the time and the money to sit down and do a 6-volume work?
Well, Dr. Clarke, I would like you to hold it right there. Yes, thank you. Hold it right there. Sometimes you regret having to ask a question that is so obvious that it almost hurts. Okay, now let's get into the fray. We will have the scholars asking questions of each other. And I'd like to start with Professor Lefkowitz asking a question of Professor Bernal.
I'd like to ask Professor Bernal if he could point to some specific instances which he could cite where Egyptian thought influenced Greek philosophy directly, and if he could discuss some of those for us.
Well, the Greek philosophers were extremely respectful towards Egyptian philosophy, and particularly Plato in his later dialogues. The emphasis on geometry, which was the great strength of Egyptian mathematics and was the center of the Platonic educational system, I think is one example. I would also think that the system of ideas or forms which Parmenides and Plato pushed looks extremely Egyptian to me, but I can't prove it. I also think that the distinction between worlds of being and worlds of becoming, which fits Egyptian grammar extremely well and Egyptian cosmological notions extremely well, look very influential. I think that the Greek tradition, which was that Pythagoras and Plato had drawn from Egypt, seems altogether plausible. But what I insist, and here's our major methodological difference, is that I don't believe one can establish proof in these distant areas of history. One has to work on a system of probability, or what I call competitive plausibility. What is less unlikely than the other? Given the closeness of the two countries geographically, the contact that we know was taking place in the 6th and 5th century, when Greek philosophy began to be formed, the likelihood of contact is extremely high, and I think if anyone should have to prove anything, it should be those who would deny that there were significant Egyptian influences on Greek philosophy at this time, as the Greeks themselves associated the word philosophy with Egypt in their earliest references to it. It seems very strange that the people who maintain the Greeks' own tradition on this subject should be asked to prove their case rather than those who challenge it.
Well, I think those are some interesting ideas, and I would like to think very hard about them, but I think we must also think about the things that are very different and very, very confusing in the tradition, such as some of the things that are said about that Pythagoras learned in Egypt. He couldn't have learned there because they aren't Egyptian, particularly. There are some mistakes that are made in the Greek understanding of Egypt. And one problem is, in thinking about this contiguity, very few Greeks could get to Egypt over a long period of time, say from the 10th century to the 7th century. Then there was a window of opportunity, but then again the Persians moved in, kept the Greeks from getting there in any great number, and really until the conquest of Egypt by Alexander.
I hate to interrupt you, Professor Lefkowitz, but the idea here is to not just explain the question that you yourself have asked, but to follow through based on the response you got.
Well, I thought that's what I was doing, but...
All right, well then, actually we differ there. Professor Lefkowitz, would you like to ask a question? Professor Bernal, would you like to ask a question of Professor Lefkowitz?
Yes, as she and the predominant view of classicists at the moment concede that Egyptian art and architecture, and she's just written an article in the New Yorker showing a particular medical view was taken by the Greeks from Egypt, why is it so implausible to suppose that the Greeks took other aspects of their culture, particularly in this period, I believe also much earlier as well? What is the reason for denying the possibility, which was brought up by the Greeks themselves, of transmission of mathematical and philosophical ideas at the same time?
There's no reason to deny it. It's just simply to try and find what these ideas were. Now, in the case of the medical thing that you mentioned, it happens to be a particularly wrong idea, and of course, wrong ideas can be transmitted as well as right ideas. And this is one thing that in tracing the history of the world, we tend to concentrate so much on the glorious achievements and the glories of Greece, the glories of Egypt. There are also some non-glories, and some of the medical ideas were one of them. I think we're all very lucky not to have been living at that time. But I would say there's nothing implausible about it at all. And there is a great Greek interest in Egypt, as you say, and that surfaces very clearly in the later dialogues of Plato. But I think that if you're going to talk about stealing ideas from Egypt, which I know you are not, but others have, then you really have to show some parallel text and show what is done. I think the idea of some influence is something that could fruitfully be discussed and pursued, and I would like to continue to do that and to continue to encourage others to work on that.
You want to follow up on your question?
No, I'll leave it for there, if we can have further talk.
All right, Professor Rogers, you get to ask Professor Clarke a question.
Yeah. I hardly know where to begin. One thing I'm curious about, I had a quick look actually at the introduction to the second edition of Bradley's The Iceman Inheritance, a very interesting book with a lot of interesting hypotheses about the origins of cultures and civilizations. Professor Clarke wrote an introduction to the second edition to it, in which he stated that the first show of European literary intelligence surfaced around 1250 BCE with the publication of two books of folklore, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And that struck me as somewhat curious because, in fact, as far as most scholars seem to be able to tell, the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed actually orally and didn't reach a literary form, if you mean by that a written form, until probably the 6th century BCE in Athens. There are obviously texts from Mycenae and Crete and elsewhere with real Greek in a literary form from before 1250, in fact, going back probably to 1600 or so. But this has significant implications for the idea, which some scholars have put forth, that Egyptian language was deeply influential on the first form of Greek that we have, that is the Linear B tablets.
What's your question? I'm waiting on the question.
That is my question. Professor Clarke has stated that this is the first form of literary intelligence that surfaced around 1250, and in fact it did not, and I'm curious how he is maintaining that.
All right.
It is the first book, and it's a book of folklore, and we really don't know whether Homer wrote it or whether Homer was man or woman. It's the first book to become known basic to the West in a form that we could study and conjecture about, and it emerged at the time Europe was beginning to show some intellectual maturity. And if you deal with this, you have to deal with what Professor Lefkowitz accused me of, not paying attention to historical chronology. And if she read any of my texts, any of my numerous guides and curriculars and lecture notes, you know that I'm a specialist on chronology. I know that one comes first and two comes second. But what I was trying to get across is that in the 8th century to the 12th century, so the intellectual emergence of Europe, at a time Egypt was in its 23rd dynasty and dying after nearly 10,000 years of some forms of organized society, Europe intellectually was just being born. And I further maintain that Europe in general had nothing to do with the creation of Rome and Greece, and yet the challenge of Rome and Greece created Europe, because they were scattered tribes, and the challenge of Rome and Greece brought them together, and they became a people strong enough to create a state. If anybody got any information to the contrary, state the information to the contrary. I maintain that there was no Europe. You're giving Europe credit for things that happened before the first European war. A shoe or lived in a house that had a window. And I'm saying that you have not read, not just Massey, Joe Massey, and his European disciple, Churchward, Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man, the Origins of Religions, and his extensive work on Freemasonry. You've not read the American disciple of Massey, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, is Who is This King of Glory, one of the best written books on the Christ story, where he proves that the basis of European spirituality was taken directly from Africa.
Professor Rogers, would you like to follow on your question?
No one is actually maintaining that literary Greek culture pre-existed any number of Near Eastern cultures. Again, I find it a bit curious that...
I accept Egypt is physically a part of Africa, created by the Africans from the South.
Even if I concede or admit or agree with you that Egypt is part of Africa, what I'm about to say...
There will be order. Thank you. There will be order. Thank you very much.
Do I detect some disagreement? My point was going to be that the most recent scholarship about the genesis of those two oral epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, points, in fact, in another direction to influence, and that is, in fact, the Hittite Empire, whose documents we can read very easily, and there may well be independent confirmation of the historicity of some form of a Trojan War in those documents. And so what I'm really asking is, why is it that we're just really looking in one direction when we're talking about the origins of Greek civilization?
When Alexander entered Egypt, he wrote home to his mother and said that he at last reached the land where the Greek gods began, Apollo and Zeus. And he wanted to consult one of the great African teachers of oracles. And the oracle asked, "How old is this man?" He said, 32. They said, in 20 years, maybe he'll be wise enough to ask me a question that I care to answer.
Professor Clarke, would you like to ask Professor Rogers a question? Professor Clarke?
Yes.
It is your turn to ask Professor Rogers a question.
My main concern is that they seem to have equated the civilizations of the Tigris and the Euphrates with the civilization of the Nile. What proof do you have that the civilization of the Tigris and the Euphrates predated the civilization of the Nile?
I don't think that I said that, and I don't think that anyone maintains that. I think the Hittite Empire obviously comes at a much later period.
I know very clear when the Hittite Empire came, I know what damage they did, because I maintain that every people who came into Africa, Greeks, everything from modern day English, everybody that came into Africa did Africa more harm than good. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And that Africa owes nothing to outsiders in regard to development, because all of them declared war on African culture, war on African civilization, war on African ways of life. They began to bastardize Africa and confuse and create a kind of historical schizophrenia that the Africans hadn't even gotten rid of to this very day. And they created whole words that did not previously exist, like Middle East. Middle from what?
In round two, we will continue. Professor Clarke, you will ask the first question in round two of Professor Mary Lefkowitz.
At your own admission, you encountered J.A. Rogers 4 or 5 years ago. J.A. Rogers didn't say he was a historian. He was a searcher trying to find the role of the African personality in world history. He worked over 50 years of his life, gave his service, died broke. What gives you the audacity to think that you can dismiss Rogers out of hand, and what gave you the maturity to think that you can judge a writer like Sheikh Anta Diop, the finest historical writer we have produced in the 20th century?
Sir, what do you deal with that?
I try to ask questions of all the material I read. I try to answer those questions on the basis of the evidence, the historical evidence. It all, in my view, comes down to that. And I do not wish to criticize any individual at all. I am dealing only with written work. The people who write that, I do not always know, and I have no individual or personal criticism of them. This is the way scholars, I'm sure, as you know, proceed, and that is simply what I did. In my book, I will leave it to everyone who reads the book to judge what I did.
I think you have emphasized too much the word black, and we've made the same mistake. Black tells you how you look, but it don't tell you who you are. The proper name of a people must always relate to land, history, and culture. I did not say Cleopatra was black. I quoted someone else who inferred that. My defense of Cleopatra is not on her blackness, but on no matter whatever she was born in Africa. Her manipulation of Mark Antony and Caesar kept the worst aspect of Roman rule from the backs of Africa. I defend her as an African nationalist. And that's a good defense. And no matter what she did with her wares in and out of bed, there's a whole lot of people got less for it.
Professor Lefkowitz, you may ask a question of Professor Clarke.
Professor Clarke, do you think that we should always judge history in terms of race?
Look, there was no such thing as race in the psyche of the world until the Europeans put it into the psyche of the world. The Africans knew nothing about race and didn't think they belonged to anything called a race. And when the Africans saw the Europeans, because they have a traditional hospitality to strangers, they didn't fight them, they didn't kill, they were curious about them. And with the African explorers, especially Mungo Park, went into Africa, nobody hurt him, nobody shot at him, nobody shot any arrows at him. The Europeans went in peacefully, but the Africans heard that Mungo Park was a pork eater. Most people don't know it, but Africans were not great pork eaters, and they're not great pork eaters today. Pork was a meat you ate in certain ceremonies, certain times a year. But we were not great pork eaters before we came to the United States, or were forced to the United States. But in the United States, we had to eat the part of the pigs that white folks threw away, so we made delicacies out of it and survived. I had this argument with Malcolm X. I said, if it wasn't for the black woman making delicacies out of pig feet, pig heels, guts, chitlins, you and I wouldn't be here arguing the point. I'm afraid that you're not only a delinquent in African history, you're delinquent in African folklore. So much of our history is tied up with our folklore, but Europe has introduced words that didn't exist in anyone's vocabulary before. No one ever thought of anybody being inferior or superior. Intelligent people don't even devote. A human being can't fall into that category. And nobody had the extensive problems the Europeans had with women, because in the period of feudalism in Europe that lasted over 1,000 years, the white woman in Europe was a vassal. But the African woman had never been a vassal in that sense. If you read Shekinah Diop's The Culture Unity of Black Africa, dealing with the history of the matriarch, he's got all evidence right there that we were the first people to support a woman as head of state. We were the first people to support a woman as riding head of her army. We were the first people to make women a god.
I'd like to ask Dr. Bernal to ask of Dr. Rogers a question.
I agree. I haven't read Black Athene Revisited. I haven't yet received my copy. But I do know who the contributors are, and I have read the reviews they wrote, and these reviews, I'm told, are very similar to the ones that originally appeared. So the title Revisited is slightly misleading because these were immediate responses in the heat of polemic. Now, I have no doubt that the conclusions he summarized are the conclusions found in the book, but I'm not sure whether they're the result of an impartial selection, because having read most of the reviews, not all the reviews of my work, I find a pretty systematic selection for Black Athena Revisited from the hostile ones, and other ones which were more balanced or more friendly to me have been in fact, completely systematically not requested, or if requested, refused. And these include the 3 experts on Egyptian-Greek relations, not Egyptologists, not Hellenists, but specialists in the interrelations between the two cultures. And these 3 scholars' works were, in fact, excluded, and it seems, I wonder, if there's any other explanation for their exclusion than the fact that they would have appeared too friendly or to have taken my work too seriously, and serious is a word repeated in these reviews. Thank you.
I'm afraid I have some rather bad news for you, Professor Bernal. Professor Lefkowitz and I actually didn't read just some of the reviews of your work. We read them all. We collected them all. There's 50 pages of bibliography at the back of our book with asterisks next to the current outstanding reviews of your work from 1987 until just a few months ago. As for the selection process of the essays that went into it, I have to say to you that we, in fact, do believe that we have given a representative sample, and here's where the really bad news is. We actually excluded the ones that attacked you personally or attacked your competence for this field. As far as the 3 experts on Greek-Egyptian relations are concerned, 2 of them that you're referring to must be Eric Klein and Stanley Burstein. Eric Klein has written several articles about those relations. We, in fact, did ask him if he wanted to contribute, but he couldn't meet our deadline. When he eventually did, I'm afraid to tell you that his essay did not actually agree completely with your conclusions, but the reason why it wasn't in the collection was that it came in too late. As far as Professor Burstein is concerned, I'm afraid that his essay was much more critical than you seem to believe. So that really is the explanation, I think, for those omissions. I might say that as far as our editorial posture was concerned, we realized that these are sensitive, difficult issues. And we fully expected that we would be in this room here tonight. We didn't know the date, but we knew we'd be here. And so what we tried to do, was we tried to have what we call full disclosure. It's the reason why the book turned out to be not just another 150-page book with some essays sort of thrown together, but a book which attempts to give summaries of comprehensive accounts of the questions that Bernal raises. And we give Bernal full credit for raising those questions. I think that Professor Clarke and others are quite correct. Professor Bernal is not the first person to raise those questions, but in fact, he raised them in a compelling and interesting way, and we feel that we are giving him and those of you who are interested in these problems, as we are, complete respect, both by answering them in full and by being here tonight to defend our views.
I want to just, if I might... yes, please do. I'm sorry.
I don't expect any scholar to agree with me entirely, and what I found with the reviews he said is that they did not agree with all I said, but they took what I said seriously, and they did agree with some significant things. I don't want total praise, and I'm sure they're right that the predominant reaction from the disciplines which I am challenging is hostile. I don't question that for the moment. But the selection does include, I'm told, personal attacks on me as being a baby and various other things. So I don't think they've been quite so scrupulous as far as that is concerned. I'm also intrigued because one person who had attended the meeting, the party given for the contributors to the book, which of course I was told nothing about, described it as a lynch mob. Another mutual friend of Mary's and mine refers to it regularly as the shit on Bernal book. And so I think there are very different perceptions of this book.
Is that a title that you've come up with on the spot, or is it something you've been thinking about, Professor Bernal?
It's a title that a mutual friend of Mary's and mine uses regularly. He's a colleague at Cornell. It's not, I wouldn't have thought that up.
I think that if you look carefully, and I'm sorry, book carefully yet. I think when you do, you will see that there are not very many ad hominem attacks in it, although I find your defensiveness about that somewhat curious, since in Black Athena volumes 1 and 2, part of your methodology has involved actually contextualizing people and talking about their family relations, their own personal backgrounds. And so I'm a little bit puzzled by that kind of response.
I have no objection to people attacking me personally. What I would like to see is a all-round collection, and I think that as I live by the sword of the sociology of knowledge, I must be prepared to die by it. I think that people will see in 20 years where I'm coming from or what my personal problems or axes were. And I think that's part of the story of the book. But I think there's also the substance of the book. And I would have hoped to have found more, a wider scan, and we've had many collected volumes on this. I mean, don't think this is the first response to my work. There have been 4 journals now have had selections of articles on my responses and their responses to my responses, and there has been real dialogue. This was a book which I was not told about till long after it had begun, and when I was told about it and asked if I could see the pieces to write a response, I was told there was to be no response, and furthermore that the responses that I had published to the articles criticizing me were not to be included. This does not seem to me opening the debate, it seems to me stamping out heresy.
May I respond to that briefly?
We will have a free-for-all in a minute. But I wanted to follow up on a phrase that you said, and I didn't want to leave it unaddressed, the issue of full disclosure. And it is to that I'd like to ask the question of Professor Lefkowitz. Are you comfortable with the fact, you obviously were comfortable with the fact that your book, Not Out of Africa, subtitled How Afrocentrism Became an Excuse to Teach Myth as History, was underwritten by several foundations that have reportedly rightist leanings. I wondered whether this was a reflection of your own personal or ideological view, or whether you were just so cash-strapped that you took money from anyone.
No one tells me what to think, and no one tells me what to say except me, and the main financing of this book was out of my own pocket.
But surely you can appreciate the color of accepting funds from foundations that do not enjoy wide acclaim and receptivity. And I thought that maybe there was some concern on your part, in as much as you are interested in integrity, scholastic integrity and all, that you might have foregone the grants in the interest of academic and scholarly integrity.
If they had asked of me to do anything, I would not have accepted these grants. They did not do that. Therefore, the grants did not go to me. They went to Wellesley College, which had no objection to taking the money.
But still, the question remains. You have a duty, do you not, inasmuch as you are preparing work, the aim of which is to overturn the revisionism, you say, that is going on in black studies, particularly in African studies, this whole battle that you have been dealing with in terms of Afrocentricity. Do you not, regardless of where Wellesley chose to accept money from, do you not, as a scholar, have an obligation to discern where this money is coming from, to see whether the source is compatible with your own views as a scholar?
I did not see anything in the conditions of the grant that inhibited what I did and what I meant to do or say or think. I believe that I acted with perfect integrity. Now, you may disagree with that, and you may disagree with the aims of those foundations and other foundations, and that is what we do in a free country. Until they are outlawed, I don't see what else can be done.
Well, let me ask you the question perhaps more directly. Had there been, say, a foundation to wipe out scholarship of any sort, if such a foundation were to have given money to Wellesley College, would you have found it equally acceptable to take money from such a foundation to further your work?
I don't know what foundation you're talking about. This seems to be a
It was a hypothetical question.
It's totally hypothetical. I don't know what you're trying to force me to say or to compel me into what
understand.
corner you're tending to put me.
I'm not forcing
you. Go ahead and attack me.
I'm not
That's
forcing
fine.
you to say anything, Professor Lefkowitz. I'm just trying to elicit a cogent response from you.
Well, you be the judge of my response.
All right. Okay, in this last round, before we get to questions, and we will get to questions, but let me warn you, you ought to have questions that are questions, not lectures, and that are straight to the point. In this round, it will be a free-for-all in which all of the discussants are permitted to ask questions of each other and to chime in responses whether they are asked the question directly or not.
Will we have time to sum up afterwards?
Yes, you certainly will.
Your treat. I think we should. All right. I just wanted Professor Lefkowitz to know some basic information about the concept of Afrocentricity. There's a lot of people who believe in the African awakening and discovering of their history and their culture who do not accept the word Afrocentricity because it's a compromise with the word Africa. It's either African centricity or it's nothing. That's right. And if she attacks Afrocentricity as the teacher of myth, have she attacked the nonsense about Columbus discovering America? Because he discovered absolutely nothing, and he committed an act of genocide. He set in motion an act of genocide 10 times worse than the act of genocide in Europe called the Holocaust, as though that was the only Holocaust in the world. That event in Europe was wrong. And even if only 6 people were killed, it was wrong. But it was a matter started in Europe by Europeans that should have been solved in Europe by Europeans.
I'm sure that you're aware, as we are, that there's a spectrum of Afro and African-centric views. I'm a little bit curious what you think then of the work of Asante, who, as far as I know, does call himself an Afrocentrist. Are you saying that Professor Asante's work actually is flawed conceptually?
I'm saying that all work under the guise of Afrocentrist is not perfect, but it is an earnest effort to restore Africa to a proper commentary in human history. I think Professor Asante's work is written too fast, and that some things he hadn't checked out as well as he need to. And I think too many times Afrocentricity becomes a personality cult, but that don't mean that I'm against African people discovering their history, their literature, their place in the political science of the world. That don't mean that I have not played a role in encouraging people to write about Africans in all the societies of the world. See, your talk keeps telling me what you have not read. You could not have been asking these questions about Afrocentricity if you have not read Anacalypsis, 2 volumes dealing with the massive expulsion of African people throughout the whole world. You could not possibly have read with any degree of understanding the 3 volumes, Africans in early Asia, Africans in early Europe, Africans in early America. We're not talking about no hearsay. We're talking about documents. Professor Joseph Harris's book dealing with the global dimensions of the African diaspora. I don't know, I mean, you keep telling me, you keep confessing your ignorance with your questions. You have not read, I'm telling you, before Afrocentricity, radical Europeans had pioneered in this work. Now, I haven't even mentioned the radical black writers that you probably have not read. Now, if you read Chancellor Williams' chapter 2 in the book, Destruction of Black Civilization, read that chapter 2 called Egypt, Ethiopia's oldest daughter. And it deals with the southern African origins of Egypt. If you read a book called Nubia, Corridor to Africa, once more you got it. Also you got the early Arab slave trade. I keep saying nobody came into Africa to do African people any good. After the Romans had disgraced themselves trying to be early Christians, the Africans thought that by accepting Islam, they could get the Romans off of their back. They were right. They did get the Romans off their back, but the Arabs replaced the Romans on their back, and the Arabs are still on their back.
Speaking of book reading, I'm a little bit curious then. One book I have read is Civilization and Barbarism, in which a scholar that we've talked a little bit about has written that the 18th dynasty in Egypt, quote, colonized all the Aegean Sea and consequently brought the region of the world out of proto-history into the historical cycle of humanity by the introduction of writing, linear A and linear B. And I'm quite curious what Professor Banal thinks of such a hypothesis.
Clearly, linear A and linear B do not come from Egyptian hieroglyphics. It is an Aegean and an Anatolian script. On the other hand, there's no doubt that Egyptian relations with the Aegean intensified a great deal during the 18th dynasty, and we have documents and paintings representing what the Egyptians interpreted as people from the Aegean bringing tribute to Africa. We also have scholars like Professor Redford in Toronto who takes it for granted that there was regular correspondence between the court in Mycenae and the court in Thebes. And there's no doubt which was the more powerful state. There is archaeological evidence of contact at that time, but Greece was already literate in its own scripts of linear A and linear B. I was rather intrigued by Professor Rogers mentioning texts, Greek texts in the 16th century. I don't know what he's referring to there, that the linear B texts are 2 or 3 centuries later, but that's a side issue, I agree.
Actually, it's not a side issue. I'm afraid that Chadwick and others have now updated the earliest linear B tablets, but I would like to come back to you for a second now that we're talking about the 18th dynasty, because as I'm sure you know, the funeral stele of Amenhotep has been used actually to make some claims by some scholars about Egyptian dominion at that time over the Aegean. But since you've mentioned Professor Klein, in fact, both Professor Klein and Professor O'Connor at the Institute of Fine Arts here in New York, I think have shown fairly clearly that this in fact is not the case. So this leads me onto a point about source criticism, and I would like to raise this as a general point, that one of the very curious things to us about Black Athena is that it does appear to us that the rules of the sociology of knowledge appear to apply to scholars of the 18th and 19th century, but not, for instance, to Herodotus or texts which seem to support Professor Bernal's point of view. And I'm wondering then since we're speaking of principles of selectivity, what then the principle of selectivity for the sociology of knowledge might be?
The reasons why, I don't accept Herodotus uncritically. I think one should try and check Herodotus wherever possible, but I think one should also check the 19th and 20th century scholars thoroughly. The reasons why I, on the whole, incline to believe Herodotus more than the 19th century scholars, I outlined before. That is that Greeks were torn in their attitude towards Egypt and towards Southwest Asia. Herodotus' main purpose was to illustrate the constant struggle between Europe and Asia, between Greeks and others. And so in a way, his description of Egypt as a source of great Greek culture goes against his ideological aim, and I find that more plausible than the 19th and 20th century scholars who were profoundly influenced by Eurocentrism and by the triumphs of Europe in their own epoch to push Greece into Europe and away from the Mediterranean, and I feel that there was no countervailing force affecting the 19th and 20th century historians. And the power of racism and later anti-Semitism, I think, was extraordinarily effective.
I think it's also important for the audience to realize that while it's true that Herodotus is a very interesting and intriguing source for Egyptian and other cultures' history in the Near East, Herodotus also tells us that there were flying snakes in Arabia. He also tells us that in the north of India that there were ants that were actually larger than foxes but smaller than dogs, which dug up gold for their Indian masters to be sent to the Persian Empire as a form of tribute. I think that these kinds of stories in Herodotus should caution us against using Herodotus at face value. I think that people should think in a common sense sort of way about Herodotus. Herodotus was a Greek who knew no Egyptian. When he went to Egypt and asked questions about Egyptian culture, he was unable to check any of the stories that were told to him about Egyptian culture. He could read no documents in Egyptian. If anyone in this room went to a country where they could not speak the language and they could not read any of the texts of that culture, would you necessarily believe everything that you were told about that culture?
Sorry, would you believe the reports rather than what you were told? There are many Western travelers who have done that. Edgar Snow couldn't speak sufficient Chinese and certainly couldn't read Chinese, and yet he wrote very interesting reports about China. It is possible for an intelligent person with judgment living in the country and viewing it to get good views. But I agree that Herodotus makes many statements that offend our laws of natural history, and therefore they should be discounted immediately. On the other hand, the 19th century scholars believed in such things as races, racial essences, the bad effects of racial mixture. All these things are much more relevant to the study of relations between Egypt and Phoenicia and Greece than belief in medium-sized ants. These are the relevant issues, and these are fantasies that were held by the 19th and early 20th century scholars.
I'm surprised that no one mentioned the book When Egypt Ruled the East by Keith Seeley. What you call Western Asia, what is Western Asia, mistakenly called the Middle East, was an extension of Africa itself. It was really Northeast Africa. And the people were interchangeable, and we seem to have neglected this very important aspect of. Then, in looking at Herodotus, Herodotus was no fool. Herodotus was a good reporter. When you told him something he didn't believe, he said he didn't believe it. But he said the tint of the complexion of the Ethiopians and the Egyptians seemed to be the same. So let us at least concede, that's not an analysis now, that's an observation. Let us concede that Herodotus at least had good eyesight.
Is Professor Clarke claiming that Herodotus did go to Ethiopia?
He encountered Ethiopians as well as the Egyptians, the people, we misuse the word Egyptian anyway. That's a Greek word, and the Africans never call that country Egypt. But he encountered both. Then there were other writers. Count Varney's Runs of Empires and DeLepsis' work on the comparative study between the cultures of the Upper and the Lower Nile mean that you people keep telling me what you have not read.
Well, one of the things that we did read, and we did actually put in our volume, was a very long and comprehensive essay by Frank Snowden of Howard University, who I'm afraid to say disagrees with you completely and cites many Greek writers and also Egyptian sources who make differences in their observations.
Look, Frank Snowden, Skip Gates, Appear, all these cop-outs running from black people and trying to get accepted by white people. We cannot be judged by these phonies. You will not dare judge the Jewish people and their plight in Germany by the Juderon. These are the Jewish police who chose other Jews to go to the gas chamber. You will not judge Jewish people by that, on that method. And you cannot judge us by cop-outs and runaways and professional white ass kissers.
Excuse me. Yes, you're quite right. I don't make judgments upon people based on those kinds of slanders. I judge their evidence.
What evidence?
But the question arose early in this conversation, Professor Rogers. How prepared are you to be a judge? That was the initial question that I asked you. If you're saying that you're basing a conclusion on the writings of someone without yourself being able independently to assess the validity of what they say, I'm not so sure that you are well equipped to judge.
I am judging based on the evidence, and I think in discussing Herodotus, I've given some very, very good examples of my familiarity with that text, and I really haven't had responses which show very much familiarity with the details of Herodotus' text and his observations, I'm afraid.
You've conducted, how long have you been, I hate to say this, but how long have you been in this storm?
Sorry.
5 years?
Sorry.
In this area of study.
I think I mentioned at the beginning that my undergraduate training was specifically in Near Eastern ancient history, so that's about 20 years ago at this point.
My undergraduate training is in economics, but I will not exactly say that I would go up against a real economist. It still is a BA degree, after all.
Well, my PhD is actually in classics and ancient history, and I'm curious now that we're raising the question of qualifications, and you're asking me about judging those texts, whether in fact you do read Greek.
Yes.
Let me handle it. Then perhaps you would like to tell me that when Herodotus uses the term melankroes to describe Egyptians, what he means.
I go back to my answer. I am not here proclaiming to be an expert on Herodotus or any of the so-called Greek philosophers.
But that's a Greek question.
No, it's not a Greek question at all. It is a question that you ask an expert, and I am not here claiming to be an expert. I also, in case you would like to know, have a distinction in Latin, and I speak German and French and Spanish, and a distinction in English as well. So I'm somewhat literate. I'm concerned, though, that so far I've been hearing bits and pieces of the discussion in specificity. You take fact A and you argue fact A, and you get a response based on fact A. I'm not so sure, though, that you have accomplished the major objective here tonight, which is to argue that bodies of work have no legitimacy. I would like you, in concluding, to at least get to that issue, that entire bodies of work have no legitimacy.
What does that mean?
Yes. All right, the order would be as follows. We'll start with Dr. Rogers, and then we will go to Dr. Lefkowitz, to Dr. Bernal, to Dr. Clarke.
I'm baffled by that introduction about bodies of work. I don't think that has anything to do with anything that either Professor Lefkowitz or I have said. But since you've asked me to conclude something about what we are trying to persuade people of, what I would say is this, that professors...
I just don't want you to conclude about something that was not asked, so I would like to document it from the book. You claim, for example, and I'm reading from the cover, the back cover, the contributors to this volume argue that Bernal's claims are exaggerated and in many cases unjustified. You say also in the work, Bernal proposed a radical reinterpretation of the roots of classical civilization, contending that ancient Greek culture derived from Egypt and Phoenicia, and that European scholars have been biased against the notion of Egyptian and Phoenician influence on Western civilization. Since this is a 20-member compendium, I think it suggests that they're attacking a body of work.
I hope that in reading the back jacket cover and our description of Professor Bernal's enterprise, that we've been fair to him insofar as what he takes his project to be about. As far as I understand it, I think it is fair. My conclusion about that has to be framed in terms of what the object of that body of work is about. Professor Bernal says that his object, the cultural purpose, political purpose of Black Athena is to lessen European cultural arrogance. My question is, does it lessen European cultural arrogance to argue that early Greek culture was derived from Egypt and/or Phoenicia. If we start out from the premise that we study Egypt or Phoenicia for what they contributed to early Greek culture, my opinion is that we are undervaluing Egypt and Phoenicia. And therefore, the project itself is, in the end, essentially Eurocentric and is its own refutation.
I think one can agree with the project of lessening European cultural arrogance completely, and that we applaud all efforts to do so. What we are concerned with is trying to establish what historical evidence shows the influence of what on what. And this is not a project which any of us here can complete at all. That many people must be involved in this, and it requires the thought and efforts of a lot of us to do it. We would like to think that it can be redone without rewriting history altogether, or without claiming that there has been a huge European cover-up of information. There is certainly true. You can claim that, but please remember, you must also show that it has been done. There are many things that Europe has been guilty of and responsible for, and certainly the covering, not the covering up, I don't mean to say that, but the absolute refusal to acknowledge the history of Africa, which I made reference to in my opening remarks, is something that we must continuously work on redressing. Much more must be learned, much more must be studied. I am very much in favor of that, and I believe that can start also in our teaching of American history, where in many cases the whole history of the African American contribution to American history has been ignored and neglected, and there are brilliant writers out there whose works are not being read. I think we should change all that. But we do not have to rewrite ancient history completely in order to do some of these important things. I would just simply ask, let us investigate carefully the degree of Egyptian influence on ancient Greece, where we must also investigate the Near Eastern cultures such as Phoenicia and the Hittites. After all, Phoenicia gave ancient Greece her alphabet. They didn't learn the alphabet from the Egyptians. It was too hard. It was easier to get it from the Phoenicians. And we must begin to work on those lines. I would like to see everyone work also on a period we haven't discussed much here tonight, where we really do see Egyptian influence on Greek culture, and that is in the Hellenistic period after Alexander got there and Greeks were living in Egypt. A huge number of Greeks were living in Egypt. There, I think you can see some real influence.
This is now the third debate that we have had, and I'm very struck by what I see as a discrepancy between Mary Lefkowitz's speech and her writing. That in speech, she is all sweetness and light and for open debate and openness in culture. Her writing is very different. The title, Not Out of Africa, is extremely provocative, and it reads, the text carries on in the same way. And I'd like to quote to you a letter I received from probably the most distinguished active classicist in the world today, who actually agrees with her on the academic side. Nevertheless, he writes, "I do not find her exposition cool, detached, and reasonable, despite her efforts to make it seem like that. It is, in fact, as I wrote in my review, an impassioned polemic. Of course, Mary wants to look scholarly and detached, but hers is the scholarship of the National Association of Scholars, which is funded by the same people that funded not out of Africa. And that leads us back to where Professor Clarke began on the general political context in which this book has appeared.
I will defend Professor LEFKOWITZ's innocence because she is a pawn in somebody else's game. As I said in the beginning, it is beyond the lack and dislike of Afrocentricity, which has not even developed enough to be called a discipline. It is a world war to prepare the mind to accept the re-enslavement of Africa, to remove from the mind of all people anything good that the African has done, and to ignore the fact that Europe set up Africa to fall apart by imposing on Africa, through miseducated Africans, a nation state. The nation state is un-African. The African thrived at his best in the territorial state. Many cultures, many languages, side by side, challenging each other, fertilizing each other. What you might call an empire, if you study the last 1,000 years before slavery, the development of independent states in the Western Sudan, Ghana, Mali, Songhay, destroyed by the invasion from North Africa by the Arabs attacking the North African Muslims, attacking the African Muslims, and destroying the great University of Sankore and exiling its greatest scholar, Ahmed Baba, who admonished his students, believe in God and science. The Africans never separated God from science. The priest was scientists. The priest was the most knowledgeable person. That's why you had the concept of a priest God. Now, if they wipe this out of the mind of our children, and our children look at television and sound bites and think they were nothing but a nothing, when they re-enslaved Africa, they're going to say, good father. They're preparing us to accept it. They're preparing the world to accept the re-enslavement of African people all over the world. And I'm saying that Ms. LEFKOWITZ is a pawn in their game, in the tragic irony of it. She is the pawn in the game of people who turn their backs on her people and let them be killed by the millions. American intelligence, French intelligence, British intelligence, the intelligence of the Western world knew exactly what was happening to the Jews in Germany. We raised our voice against this in the old Harlem History Club, 1939 to the death of the leader in 1941. If you think that, if we get into the nonsense about black anti-Semitism, blacks have always had a sentimental attachment to the Jews. They actually believe the Bible. You know, we are the true believers. We out Pope the Pope, we out Muhammad Muhammad. But religion has always been a political thing to Europeans, and still is. And when it no longer serves them politically, they're going to discard it. They turn their backs and let this happen. Now they're creating a new game because Europe has spoiled Europe. They want to take some geography outside of Europe. They say the people they're going to take the geography from are unworthy. They can't rule themselves. Of course, they cannot rule themselves in artificial states set up by the Europeans. First thing the Africa has to do is to just get rid of these borders. reestablish the borders along the old lines, and integrate Africans into Africans.
Okay. Well, now it's the time for you to talk. And again, I'm going to be ruthless. You should have questions, and we're interested in dialogue, not diatribe. All right, what are they setting up microphones, I believe.
In your statement in your book about Masonry, I have to disagree with. And I'd like to know how much research you've done on Masonry, which was a bastardized word given by Pythagoras. Masonry was not always known as Masonry. It was called the study of lux.
Would you please identify the
And lux in Latin is light.
No. Could you identify the incorrect statement?
She said that the abbey, that the statement in the book pertaining to the mystery system coming from the book, the abbey's book in the 18th century, the study of lux preceded what they call Masonry. Pythagoras gave it that name. It's a Latin term, summi medio coli. Just as Pythagoras gave the name gymnasium to schools of learning, that's what it was at that time. What they call lodges now, they call gymnasiums. You use the term about the Afrocentrism coming from Masonic Caribbean Lodge. That is a falsehood, ma'am. That is a total unfalsehood.
Okay.
Do you have any research in Masonry? Did you do any research?
I refer you to the section of my book which has the footnotes in it, and I would appreciate it if you feel these things are true, that you write me about it, and I'll respond.
I have read your book. No, I have read your book, and I have already, within 50 pages, 47 rebuttals to your book. When mine comes out, you'll have it, ma'am.
We didn't hear a response, Dr. Lefkowitz.
It would be I certainly read quite a few books. They are cited in the footnotes to the chapter where I discussed that. I try to explain why I believe, on the basis of the evidence that I have presented in the book, that Masonry, the mythology that I believe is behind some of the ideas that Greek philosophy was stolen from Egypt, come from an 18th century French novel. And I put all the information out in my book. If you disagree with my book, there you are. I mean, that is the point of what we are doing, is to argue and discuss and to proceed from there.
I should advise the audience that the books are available right outside, so you can pick up a copy of all books mentioned here tonight. Yes, not all of them, but you know. Hello. Yes?
Good evening to everyone here tonight.
Thank you.
It's an honor, and a privilege, and a pleasure to be here for this historic event.
Great. Get to your question.
My question, I have a couple of quick questions.
No, one.
Just one question?
That's the quota tonight.
Oh my God. Okay. Oh man. Okay.
Well, what you could do is you could step to the side and pick one.
Okay, my question is for just one question for everybody.
Just one question.
Okay. That's difficult. Okay. My question is for you, Dr. Lefkowitz. Did the ancient Greeks espouse white supremacy?
Thank you.
I believe that the ancient Greeks did not do that. I believe that the ancient world in general did not have the problems with racism which our society is so fraught with today. And that is one of the great reasons why I, in many ways, am happier studying the ancient world.
The same. I've got a question for you. And I would like to know from you, would you say that James Breasted, who founded the Institute of Oriental Studies for the University of Chicago, is a liar? Then you haven't read his works because I have it right here, and he made no bones about what the Greeks got from the Egyptians. And when Dr. Clarke mentioned to you about Herodotus, Herodotus said this. He says, I cannot say with certainty which supposition is the right one, but I noticed this myself before I asked any question, both in cultures and in Egypt. And the Egyptians, the Chaldeans remember the Egyptians much more distinctly than the Egyptians remember them. For the Chaldeans said that they thought that they were offsprings from the soldiers left there by Sesostris, who was the head of the Egyptians. He went on further to say that the Chaldeans, the Egyptians and Ethiopians had black skin and woolly hair.
Right.
And let me remind you that if you know anything about Greek mythology, you would have read about Achaemenid. Achaemenid in Greek mythology is actually King Amenhotep III.
It's Agamemnon, actually.
Agamemnon.
Again, I must insist, why impressive as it was, I must insist just the same on questions.
Okay, as a student of Afrocentricity from Temple, first of all, if you read Chinwezu, he talks about Aristotle calling the Egyptians cowards because they were black. So there was some form of supremacy in Greece around that time. My question, though, however, is this.
Your question to whom, sir?
Well, to basically, anybody could pick it up.
Okay.
Why do these Hellenists, or whatever you call them, these Greek scholars, Eurocentric classicists, find it so difficult, okay, to admit the Africanity of Egyptian civilization when you have practices like circumcision, which even Semites like Abraham comes to the area to learn and all of that. When you look at the American Heritage Dictionary, for instance, even though you have African words in the dictionary, we are not part of the world root of languages and all of that. How can you cut off a whole seminal culture and yet refuse to accept, you refuse to accept the contribution of African civilizations to Mycenium or whatever, and yet you appropriate our languages and our cultures, even though linguistically we've been excluded from this language too. How do you do
All right,
that?
thank you.
I don't think that anyone maintains that ancient Egypt wasn't part of the continent of Africa, so that's a sort of non-starter. Secondly,
Order, please. I feel like Judge Ito.
Secondly, linguistically, I don't think that anyone I know believes that ancient Greek, in its majority, is derived from the Afro-Asiatic language group. I think that the placement of Greek into the Indo-European language group sets it in a different context. I have no problem acknowledging Greece's debts to many different Near Eastern cultures. Doesn't bother me at all.
Professor Clarke, would you like to respond? Professor Clarke?
Do you want to respond?
I'm wondering why we seem to be putting our emphasis in the wrong place. We're giving Greeks credit for something they did not do. We're not analyzing the fact that at the time Greece and Rome was at their height, the majority of their own people were slaves. And that people who created the word democracy and popularized the word Christians were neither democratic or Christians then or now. And so we are following a myth they created far worse than any myth the Afrocentrics have created or accused to have been created. My criticism of Afrocentricity is its inadequacy. It hasn't gone far enough.
Question, please.
Yes, thank you for giving me this opportunity. For number one, I would like to say I think Mary is just here to sell a book. And number two...
We're not going to make those kinds of observations. We're going to get to your question. Question.
It's to Mr. Bernal. And he made one remark in a previous debate that they had together that the library in Alexandria was Greek created. I would like to know, how did he come to that conclusion?
Well, first of all, that it was built in a city, Alexandria, which was built by the Greek or Macedonian conquerors of Egypt, and the library was built in it. Now, what the precedents for the library is difficult. Perhaps Aristotle's collection of books in the Lyceum were precedent, but there were clearly Egyptian libraries per Ankh-II. So the idea of a library, I think, is Egypto-Greek. But that library itself was clearly constructed after Aristotle's death and under the domination of Greeks.
Anybody else? Anybody would like to respond? Professor Clarke?
I think the whole concept of the library at Alexandria might be an often repeated myth, and it might not have existed at all. We have not found any foundation. Now, you can burn the building, but you can't burn the foundation because that's underground. Well, according to most information I know, the books in the library consist of raping a lot of small libraries in Egypt. And so when they burned down the library, they burned and lost to the world information that will never be recovered. So I don't think the library was a service, although it is spoken of as a high point of Greek intellectual contribution. It was not. It was part of Greek imperialism, the raping of the small African libraries. He consolidated the books. Had he left them scattered in small libraries, we might still have access to them. But you put them in one place that got burned down, and the world can never recover that information. So I don't consider the library at Alexandria any compliment to African people or Greeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One quick addition to that. The previous gentleman, or the gentleman before, raised the question of a gymnasium, and this question is really about a library. I quite agree with Professor Clarke that to think of it in terms of any notion of a modern library is fundamentally deceptive. At the time that we do have literary sources for what was in the library at Alexandria, most of that information talks about papyrus rolls. Furthermore, a gymnasium in that time period is not a modern gymnasium, but I think, as the gentleman was implying, was a cultural institution involved with education, military training, and a lot of other activities. So,
thank you for your question. Hello.
Yeah, I have two questions, but I know I cannot ask two questions.
So then don't start it. Just ask one.
I'll ask one question in two parts.
No. Guess what?
Yeah.
You will ask one question in one part.
It seems to be that all four of our distinguished scholars could be congratulating each other because they all have really contributed much to our knowledge. Instead, they act like those proverbial blind men holding on to different part of an elephant and saying, I've got him. And the question is, why is it that you cannot appreciate each other instead of insulting each other? Now,
thank you. That's it.
No, second.
No, there's no second.
No, just a suggestion. Now, of course, what is behind, I suppose, is the political conflict. And what I want to ask is
No, but you're asking a second question. So you already asked your first question.
Just indicate the direction. Did Professor Clarke or did not Professor Clarke state on WBAI, or what it's recorded, that African Americans cannot be friends of the Jews in the United States because they are too powerful here?
No. I did not state that.
All right.
No, he said that I stated it?
Yes.
I've never stated it. I never stated it at all. I wanted to stay away from the Jewish question because everybody become a liar and a hypocrite when they're discussing it. They're dishonest. I want to also stay away from the Muslim question because everybody's dishonest when they discuss that. And I want to stay away from the fakery of Louis Farrakhan.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Next question, please.
Hi.
Yes, let's simmer down.
Well, first, I'd just like to say a quick comment on the politics behind this book. Already at City College, they're talking about closing down the ethnic studies programs and instituting it with an interdisciplinary program, which they laud will be so much better. Anyway, I do believe that your book is a part of this whole scheme, which I believe will be carried throughout this country. But anyway, that aside, I'd like to get onto my questions. I did flip through your book, and meaning flipping through, because I just found it very, for lack of words, I would have to go back to Mr. Clarke's, Dr. Clarke's sophomoric book, because it left many holes, and you contradicted yourself with the very same contradictions that you were blaming all these other authors for having done.
So the question
comes to, was Socrates black? And I felt that you were like beating a dead horse on its head. Rather than ask that question, I would like to ask you, from this quote, it says, I got it out of a book today, Socrates was prosecuted on a charge of impiety, quote, for not worshiping the gods whom the city worships, for introducing religious innovations, and for corrupting the young men. Now this was, I believe, in the trial of Socrates. And the question being, if so, this is indigenous Greek philosophy coming out from philosophy, and he was eventually put to death by talking about his philosophy and influencing the young minds of Greece, Athens, then, I'm not sure if it was Athens or Sparta, I forget. But then my question to you is, what then is so Greek about Socrates? So that's my question to my Lefkowitz.
Well, that's to Mary Lefkowitz.
I'm not sure I understand your question. I'm certainly glad that
Order.
I'm so Greek about Socrates.
Can I reiterate this again?
No, I think you've asked several questions there. I'm sure glad you like my book so much. But let me just say that Socrates tells us himself that he never really left Athens except on military campaign, and he stayed within Greece. Now, introducing new gods, I think, was a reference to his own personal god, and that's why he was tried for impiety. People did not have their own personal gods. They had to believe in the gods the city believed in. It's a long story. There's a considerable bibliography on that if you're interested. I'm sure somebody at your university could tell you. As for my being part of a conspiracy to destroy all sorts of things, I am not part of any conspiracy at all.
Dr. Clarke? Dr. Clarke, is going to respond?
I think we many times ask the right question the wrong way. The racism that we know today started in the 15th and the 16th century as a rationale for slavery. Whatever harm the Romans and the Greeks did, they had no racism compared to the racism of today. Otherwise, why would there be 3 African emperors of Rome? And why would they hit? Why would there be 3 African popes in the early Roman Church? And why would Septimus Severus become the governor of England? The country's going to become England. I'm saying that if you charge the Greeks with the same kind of color prejudice we have today, you're charging them wrong. They've got enough crimes that they're guilty of without that. They had a respect for talent wherever they found it, even among the people they conquered. And the people they conquered had upward mobility to the extent they fitted into the Greek or the Roman political intentions of that day. Now, I have gone to England and had the privilege of going in the basement of the British Museum. As a commoner, naturally I couldn't go, but when they asked the other person with me, what is your authority to enter and look at the sites in the basement of the British Museum? He was a Caribbean person who lived in America most of his life, but he wasn't a citizen, so he had officially been knighted by the Queen. And so he pulled out his card and the door to the basement opened. And we saw the picture of Herodotus, matted hair, pug nose, similar to mine. It was in, the statue was in the basement of the British Museum where it will stay and not on display. But I don't argue Herodotus on the basis of his blackness or anything else. I argue on the fact that he had wandered away from his people. He had learned a concept and a way of living, a way of morality, different from that of his people. So just like Jesus Christ, when he came back among his people, he was preaching something that alien to that place. This food driving the money changers from the temple. What do they think we're going to make money? In other words, what kind of Jew is this? A strange kind of Jew. He don't want us to engage in trade. The Romans didn't want to have anything to do with it. So when the Roman governor when he was put on trial for sorcery, the Romans, he wasn't harming the Romans. He wasn't even preaching to the Romans. He was preaching to his own people. And so he pushed them back and says, he's your king. And they pushed him back toward the Romans. He said, not my king. But he come in with all those foolish ideas. He hanging out in Egypt. So Herodotus has been, I didn't say he went to Africa, I don't know. But he was influenced by African moral thought.
Thank you. Your question, please.
I'm a student at City College, and this question's for Dr. Clarke. Please, could you explain to the right, your left?
The what?
The right, on your right, the 2 so-called professors, on your right.
Well, to his left.
On his left, on your right. The agenda of the right in the political context that lets a president of my school, Yolanda Moses, dismantle and ethnically cleanse the ethnic studies and the black studies, and Latino studies, Jewish studies, Asian studies up at City College, and because I have no respect for you, because up at City College we are fighting here every day.
All right.
For what the question is, I want Dr. Clarke to explain how this is, what's this doing to the train of thought in our universities and how it lets people politically dismantle our universities as we know them.
Thank you for your question.
This trend started soon after the Black Studies explosion. Whites began to plan how to let them use this as a political plaything until they got their act together and their strength together in order to destroy it. It wasn't meant to be, no one, if you ever got this simple thing, people never educate you in the technique you can use to take their power away from them. See, education has but one honorable purpose, one alone. Everything else is a waste of time. That to train the student to be a responsible handler of power. No one ever wants us to be responsible handlers of power. I'm saying that it has nothing to do with political lines. The left don't want us to be responsible no more than the right. But they want to dominate us in a different way from the right, and they think they can dominate us better. It's an argument of not of whether we will be free, but who will enslave us. And had we should have accepted the responsibility of making black studies strong enough to take this assault. We could have anticipated it and argued with it, but we dissipated too much energy arguing among ourselves over triviality. We are partly to blame for what has happened.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke. Your question, please.
My question is to Drs. Lefkowitz and Rogers. I would like information about the foundation and grants regarding the publication of the book. How did University of North Carolina come to choose them? Did they make the application for the grants? And what are the foundations?
Thank you.
There's a simple answer. There were none. 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 Zero. Zilch. None.
Except for a grant from Wellesley College, right? Now listen, you hear me. Wellesley College student assistants. 2 students who did research paid for by student research grants from Wellesley College. We thank Wellesley College for that.
No, we had no outside grants to write that book at all. The University of North Carolina had nothing to do with funding the book. They simply came to us 3.5 years ago and asked us to put together the book.
So you cite here, you cite in the preface to your book, we are, let me see. We thank Molly Levine of Howard University for generously allowing us to use the bibliography she had assembled, and the Ford Foundation.
That's through Wellesley College.
The Ford Foundation and Wellesley College, not through Wellesley College, for grants to support editorial assistance.
Well, I'm sorry, but the Ford Foundation has a standing grant with Wellesley College through which Wellesley College disperses money to student research assistants. There is no political... Well,
all right, well, that's the answer. The answer is there's no direct foundation link. But that is as it applies only to Black Athena Revisited, and not to any other work by you, Dr. Lefkowitz. Yes?
Okay. My question is for Professor Rogers and Lefkowitz. You claim to be in the interest of sharing knowledge and information for the betterment of the students that you teach and the people that you influence. For the duration of this debate, your colleagues on your right-hand side have given you books and information that challenge what you've said. I have not heard anything from you of a willingness to read or reassess some of the conclusions you came through with your book. So what I'd like to know is, now that you've been provided with that information, and if you're truly in the interest of telling the truth and doing the right thing, will you revisit some of what you've written?
Thank you for your question.
We wouldn't be here if we weren't interested in learning other people's views about these topics, but I would urge you to go and look at the bibliography of the book, which is very, very extensive and does, in fact, include many of the titles that we've talked about here this evening.
But that's not the question. The question was, will you, given the information that you've been given tonight, by opposing views, let's say, are you going to take another look? Are you going to revisit Black Athena Revisited?
Exactly.
Actually, we were told by Professor Bernal that he is working on a volume called Black Athena Writes Back, or is that right? So we're waiting for that. We thought it was only fair to give him a chance.
But you really didn't answer my question.
Well, I think I did.
No, no disrespect. I just want to know, are you now that you've been provided with some of these books, some of the information, names, in the interest of supposed scholarship, would you take a second look at some of the things that they're saying? Yes?
Yeah. It was noted that neither Professor Lefkowitz nor Professor Rogers seem to have written down any of the books. All right, your question, please.
We didn't have to write down all the books because we have actually read a great many of them. I wrote down several notes. If I do not agree with you, it does not mean that I have not read the same books.
We'll move on. Next question, please.
I need clarification first. Could I see the cover of Not Out of Africa? Because I don't want to base my question on something I heard about. Okay. Since this work, or what you do, is based on just scholarship and what have you, could you, as a graphic designer, could you explain that cover? I mean, yeah.
I'm not a graphic designer. The cover was the cover of the New Republic article, of the New Republic, when my article that was a review of Martin Bernal's Black Athena first appeared.
But you used it on the cover of your book.
The publishers decided to use it again because it was a New Republic book and because they thought people might remember the original cover. It appeared in 1992. It appeared in 1992 when the Spike Lee film of Malcolm X had been very popular and everyone was wearing X caps.
But I see, since we're talking about Not Out of Africa, how do you get an X cap?
The cover features a bust. I suppose this is Socrates? Yes.
Could be, but I don't think. I think it's generic philosopher.
Is it Plato? Is it? It's not Herodotus. He doesn't have woolly hair.
Well, Herodotus wouldn't have had woolly hair. That was the Colchians and the Egyptians.
But it is a bust of a. I don't know how to describe this, other than you see this kind of sculpture all the time.
Greek philosopher.
A Homeric figure with an X cap on.
Anyway, thanks.
Thank you. Question, please.
Good evening. Mr. Burnell and to Dr. Henrick Clarke. First of all, Mr. Burnell, maybe you'll be willing to explain how anti-Semitism got involved with Black Athena. Professor, what is your name, the lady, I'm sorry?
Lefkowitz.
Lefkowitz, you brought up the subject of anti-Semitism. I want to know, what does that have to do with Black Athena?
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Henry Clarke or Dr. Burnell can answer that. Thank you.
Doctor.
I don't think anti-Semitism should have been brought into the discussion at all, because most people who accuse people of being anti-Semitic have never. Most people who accuse you of being anti-Semitic have not even explained exactly what is a Semitic. It started off as a linguistic term. How did it become a racial term? There are Semitic-speaking people of all colors. So it's not an exclusive thing for the people who adopted the name Jew, mainly in Europe, because the word Jew was not used widely in the ancient world. We knew people of the Hebrew faith, but there are people of the Hebrew faith in India, China, and it's a universal religion. A lot of people belong to it, including some misguided blacks who call themselves black Jews. Now, if you want to belong to the Hebrew faith, you just belong to the Hebrew faith. It's a right. Why you have to attach color to it? The Indians don't call themselves, brown Jews. They just call themselves people who belong to the Hebrew faith. And when they went to Israel, they got the shock of their lives by being reduced to second-class citizenship.
I think that Black Athena has become involved with anti-Semitism in two ways. That is, in my book, I do spend about half the text, almost half the text, talking about Phoenician influences, that is, Semitic-speaking influences on Greece, and how anti-Semitism among European scholars in the late 19th and early 20th century affected the interpretation of those influences on Greece. So that has one big aspect, and I've been attacked for that by Tony Martin and some others for spending too much time on looking at Jewish or Semitic influences, not Jewish influence, Semitic influences. The other way in which it's become loosely attached to Black Athena is the way in which some, a very few of the people, the African Americans who are or who claim to be anti-Semitic, have liked Black Athena, but that I think is a much less important issue. I've been fighting anti-Semitism in my book, and this is something that I find extremely central. It may not be central to this audience, but it is very important to me and the way I wrote it.
Yes, we share Professor Brunel's view that there were some scholars in 18th and 19th century Europe who, for reasons of anti-Semitism, sought to exclude all kinds of people speaking Semitic languages from the story of the origins of Greek culture.
Thank you. Your question, please.
Yes, just to elaborate a little bit on the word Semite, you'll check the encyclopedia. It specifically states Afro-Asiatic, stretching all the way from West Africa into the eastern part of Africa, with a total of approximately 300 million people. Now, what I'd like to know is, first off, let me just read something here for you. And this comes out of Aristotle, okay? It comes out of Aristotle. We're talking about philosophy,
but one question, and quickly, please.
Yeah, quickly. The military class and the farming class should be separate. Even today, this is still the case in Egypt, as it is in Crete. The practice began in Egypt, okay? Then you come back again, it says, it was thus in southern Italy that a southern system of common tables originated. As we know, the population of southern Italy are black folks. Then it comes back and says the other institution mentioned above, the division of the body politic into classes, originated in Egypt, not in Crete. It continues.
No, don't continue.
Last one.
Get to your question quickly,
The history of Egypt attests the antiquity of all political institutions. Here is Aristotle is giving his expertise on philosophy to the Egyptians, yet you sit there and say that it had nothing to do with Egypt. Explain, please.
I don't think that we have said that Greek politics have nothing to do with Egyptian politics. In fact, one of the more interesting arguments that I think you'll find in our book is Sumerian scholars believe that a form of what, for want of a better term, could be called democracy actually existed perhaps on the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates in about 1800 BCE. I didn't quite understand the comment about the encyclopedia definition of Semitic, but I think I agree completely with Professor Clarke that Semitic is not a racial term. It is not a term even of culture. In principle, it should be a linguistic term.
Yes.
I think one of the reasons why the title of my book is The Afro-Asiatic Roots is because Afro-Asiatic is a super family which includes both ancient Egyptian and Semitic and many other African languages like the Chadic group and Hausa and all the rest of it. And it was one of the reasons why I wanted to be able to include both the Semitic and the Egyptian linguistic and other influences on Greece. So that, I think, is important. Now, yeah, okay, come back.
Thank you. Your question, please.
Hotep, Dr. Clarke, may I speak? Yes, go ahead, please. Thank you, sir. We at Temple University, the African American Studies Department, are taking serious Dr. Clarke's question. We're going to be issuing within 2 months a comprehensive document that go back thousands of years that includes scholars from every part of the African world, including Dr. John Henry Clarke,
Fanfanon, everyone from Otep. So this will be coming out within 2 months. So this will answer a lot of the questions that are being laid today. So you're taking a scholarship serious. And what I want to do, the question is to those two professors from Wesley. I find the book very disingenuous. I found one of the person that you mentioned and wrote inspirational in the book, Dr. Ben, our beloved Dr. Ben Jackie-Hannon. And I've known him for over 22 years.
Your question,
please. And Dr. Ben, in his 22 years of being a chematologist, had never said one time that he was an Afrocentrist. I mean, why did you say that Dr. Ben speaking at Wesley College was one of the reasons that you picked up on this project to make the Afrocentric project disingenuous? Dr. Ben has never said he is Afrocentric, not one time in the 22 years I've known him, and I know other people that known him like Dr. Jeffers and him probably more years than that. So what is this? Is this poor scholarship, or this just an attempt to continue the attack on Africa? Why do you find Africa so difficult?
Thank you very much.
I was simply talking about an incident at Wellesley when Dr. Ben Yochanan talked about the library at Alexandria and claimed that Aristotle had stolen his works from it. Perhaps the term Afrocentrism has become too widely generalized. We all are been discussing tonight a great many ways in which it's been used and misused. Professor Asante at Temple, as you of course know very well, believes, and I think this is quite true, that he has invented that term, but like all things that one invents, it gets out of hand. So that's my answer. I believe you're right that Dr. Ben refers.
Let's stop talking about usefulness and talk about honesty. Let's talk about the making of the United States, the design of this country. That it was designed as a haven for free white Protestant males, middle class and up, those who agree with the prevailing political status quo and who own property. Everybody else in this country who think this country was designed for them are telling themselves a lie. The Jews were out of it, the Catholics were out of it, the Quakers were out of it. Now look at who's held power in this nation. Only one non-Protestant president, and how long did they last before they killed him? When they said liberty and justice for all, that's the all they were talking about. Other people think they were talking about them. The country have not betrayed any promise to you, had even made any promise to you. What even talking about you in the first place? Let's tell the real truth about all the founding fathers being slaveholders. Let's read the letters George Washington wrote when he wanted some special molasses from the Caribbeans, and he offered to send one trained nigger as payment for the molasses. Let's not take George Washington out of history, but let's put the blacks in history along with him. Let's talk about James Fortan, who made the tents for George Washington. And George Washington found that those wax-matted cloth on the tents was stronger than the cloth in the breeches of his soldiers. He asked James Fortan to make some breeches of that same cloth. Those breeches made by a black man turned that terrible third and fourth winter of the American Revolution. Don't take George Washington out, but put James Fortan in with it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Bernal?
Is this a response to a question?
If you want to just add something, if you had a chance.
Are we still going on with the question session?
No, questions are done.
The questions are done?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think this has been, there's been some intellectual blood spilt, but I find it very interesting. But I'd like to end on a note that Mary Lefkowitz raises in her book, a point raised many times by Arthur J. Schlesinger, Jr., that Afrocentrist history is purely an attempt to promote group self-esteem, whereas history, and I'm quoting, should consist of dispassionate analysis, judgment, and perspective. In fact, this desirable goal is very seldom reached in schools, which nearly always stress the achievements of the dominant group or the majority group in that school. Nevertheless, I quite agree with them that one should try to transcend these intellectual or social environments and achieve objectivity as far as it's possible to do so. However, classics, based as it is in what I call the Aryan model, with its insistence on a European and pure Greece, is an extreme example of feel-good scholarship for Europeans.
Well, that brings us to the end of this meeting. I want you to give yourselves a hand for hanging in here. I want to thank you all for coming, and keep listening to your favorite station, which is WBAI 99.5 FM. Thank you and good night.